This video covers editing a tailored jacket. I'm showing this on the IDES tailored jacket block, which I'll link in the video description. I'll also link one for a male avatar. They're both available as CLO project files and as PDF patterns. What we're going to go through is adjusting the break and hem shape. Here I raised the break to create this new jacket, and I adjusted the hem shape from a cutaway curved hem to a straight hem. I'll show you how to raise or lower the notch and how I converted it from a notch lapel to a peak lapel. At the back, I also changed it from a single back vent to a double back vent. And as you can see, of course, going from a single-breasted to a double-breasted jacket. And a bit about the general rules for tailored jackets and all of those elements. Let's talk about raising and lowering the break. Effectively, we're going from this single-breasted jacket with a notched lapel to this double-breasted peak lapel jacket here. But my goal is to show you all the individual elements that you can edit to create whatever style of jacket you want. This is the IDES tailored jacket block how it comes, but of course you can do this on any jacket pattern. The first thing to be sure of is that your pattern is marked properly. So hopefully you've made your own pattern or gotten a reliable pattern from somewhere. If you bought my pattern, you'll see that there is a baseline here marking center front. And I've drawn an internal line marking at the point where the button closure is. You'll also notice that there's an actual segment point here where the break ends. And that's the most important thing you need to have in order to edit the break. You need this point here to have a segment point. This is called the break point, and this is the roll line of your lapel. What we talk about moving when we talk about the break is moving where the jacket buttons and where the lapel rolls to. You'll see these markings here, and if I turn on my internal lines in 3D, you can see this marking is my waistline. So for the IDES jacket, the break is about 1 3/8 inches below the waist. A jacket is always going to break somewhere pretty close to the waistline. They might be 1 inch or a bit more above or below the waistline, depending on design aesthetic and body type that they may be designing for. This one is on the lower side because it's just the design aesthetic. And for this jacket, I raised it up above the waistline. So in order to raise or lower the break, you're going to grab your edit pattern tool and marquee. I marquee because I want to grab the end of my roll line, the actual segment point on my pattern edge, and this internal marking I have for my button closure. Then you will need to click and drag one of those elements in one fluid motion. Once you're dragging it, then hold down your shift key to make sure you move it up in a straight line. So if I stop here, it'll put my break point at my waistline. But I'm going to drag up farther, and while dragging, I tap my right click. I'm going to raise it up the distance it was from my waistline plus 1 inch because I want it to be 1 inch above the waist. So I enter in 2.4 inches and say OK. So this is my old lapel marking here, and this is my new roll line. You may notice when you do this that it might alter the curve of your lapel. I'm not going to worry about it because I'm redesigning my lapel shape anyway, but it's worth knowing that when you move a segment point like this, it will affect the curve points that you have on either side of that segment point, and it will kind of shove them up a bit. If you don't want them to move at all, you can hold the D key while dragging, but you may find that you need to delete curve points that are close to your segment point in order to move it up if you're going to hold D. Unfortunately, the Edit Pattern tool won't move your button or buttonhole in CLO. So now I'll grab my Select Move Button tool and marquee over my button and buttonhole. I'll click and drag them up, and then tap my right click while dragging and enter in 2.4 inches, just like I did with my breakpoint. If you have any issues with things settling after simulating, you can strengthen your patterns to help the roll line set in with Ctrl H or Command L. And you can always right click on your button and reset 3D position if you need to. The process will be the same for lowering the break, you'll just slide it all down instead of up. Now I'll show you how I adjusted the hem shape. So the hem on the IDES block is a cutaway curved hem, pretty traditional for a women's tailored jacket. But when I change to a double-breasted jacket, I want to straighten that out. You'll notice I have these 2 segment points on my front edge and hem. So if you don't have any points like this and you're working with this type of hem shape, you may want to add them. You can do so by grabbing your Add Point Split Line tool and just clicking on the line. If you want to add them at a specific distance, you can right-click with either Edit Pattern or Add Point Split Line and enter in the amount. So with Edit Pattern, I'm going to grab this point and move it over until I get my guides. These guides will show up automatically to be straight down from the break line and straight out from the original point. If you have any issues with these guides, you can also go up here to this information icon, turn on your rulers, and you can click and drag a guideline from the side here and line it up with your breakpoint to check it. This works just like Adobe Illustrator. I don't really need this curved shape here, so I'm just going to select this segment point with Edit Pattern and hit Delete on my keyboard. It's going to just connect the surrounding segment points with a straight line. Then I'm going to right-click to delete my guideline. The guides in CLO are a bit annoying and they make it difficult to select and work with a point that's in line with the guide. So if you hold Shift when you drag down, you'll keep it in line with the original, but you won't get the automatic horizontal guide. So sometimes it's best to not hold Shift at all and get both of the guides. This would work if I wanted that front edge perfectly straight and that bottom corner to be 90 degrees. So let's just see what that looks like in 3D. You can see my jacket is poking through a bit from underneath, but I don't think it'll be an issue, so I'll simulate and it just kind of works itself out. You can see with hems, a straight line across will not actually look straight across when it's on the body. It's rare that you'd have something perfectly straight across at the hem when you want it to look straight in real life. The side seams are angled, so you can imagine when you sew these two together, the front would actually angle up, just as it appears here in 3D. So I'm just going to click and drag this point down, holding Shift to keep the front straight. How much you do it is up to you. I'm just going to do mine visually with what looks right in 3D. So this harsh angle would look less exaggerated once it's in a double-breasted version. And often tailored jackets do look a bit harsh like this at the front and kind of cross each other. But you can also grab your Edit Curve Point tool if you want, and add a curve point to soften the edge using your guides like this. Now let's talk about center front wrap, or the overlap of the jacket at the front. We're going to change this single-breasted jacket to a double-breasted jacket by increasing the wrap. There aren't a lot of hard and fast rules around wrap, button spacing, and placement. Most tailoring rules all come from menswear and are mostly based on what silhouette you want to achieve. For single-breasted jackets, you have basically 4 button options. The most common is 2-button. 3-button is often associated with certain eras like the 1960s. 3-roll 2 is what it's called when you have a buttonhole on the lapel that doesn't actually ever get buttoned. It's also called Neapolitan, and it gives Ivy League or dandy vibes. Single button is pretty rare amongst menswear, but I find it is nearly as common as 2-button for women's wear. Double-breasted jackets are more common in menswear since one of their main features is adding width or broadening the shoulders. It almost always corresponds with a peak lapel, which also broadens. Although peak lapels can also be on single-breasted jackets, but they're usually for more formal dinner jackets or tuxedos. These are the most typical button layouts for double-breasted jackets. They're usually described by the number of total buttons and how many are functional. So 6x2, 4x1, 6x3. These are some less common button layouts. The placement of the break, the shape of the lapel, and the width of the wrap are all going to determine what kind of shape it gives the body. So you have to think about the wearer's shape. The wrap is the amount of overlap at the front of the jacket, and it basically determines how far apart the button columns are on a double-breasted jacket. A narrower wrap is usually more modern. It can make the waist look narrower and the wearer look taller by elongating the body. A wider wrap makes the jacket and wearer look more square. Double-breasted jackets usually have peak lapels because they are wide and balance out the width of the wrap. There aren't necessarily rules around the lapel and wrap combination, but it's more about balance, and the wider the wrap, the wider the lapel that is needed to balance it out. Ideally, your lapel is a touch wider than your top button spacing if you have these wider set top buttons. One of the things I did find that's fairly standardized in terms of the button placement is for the button that is closest to the break. This one should be placed approximately 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch or 0.7 to 1 centimeter from the break point to the outside edge of the button. Mine's a little bit farther over, but that's only because my buttons are domed shank buttons that are a little bigger, so that's basically the distance from center front for all the buttons along the edge. The nice thing in CLO is that once you've chosen your button line size, the marking here in 2D should reflect that line size. Mine are 30 line buttons, so that allows me to then actually measure from the edge of my button to the break point. So use that side with the button on it as your guide. So I want to keep that spacing where it is. Then we need to determine the spacing we want between our buttons, and essentially the center front wrap. My button spacing here is about 3.5 inches or just under 9 centimeters. So from center front to the middle of that button is half that distance. What I'm going to do is with my Edit Pattern tool, I'll select the front edge of my pattern by marqueing to include the breakpoint at the bottom of the roll line. I'm also going to select the marking I have for my button. This internal waist marking is still going to stop at center front. Center front itself is not moving. So I'm going to click and drag. Make sure you don't press Shift until you've already begun dragging out. But then you want to hold Shift and move everything out. While holding all of that, you'll tap your right click and enter in half the width of your button spacing. Then with your Select Move Button tool, select your button and buttonhole, drag in the same direction as before, tap your right click and enter in the same distance. You can just copy paste your button and buttonhole, holding Shift and move to the left, then tap your right click and enter in the total button spacing of 3.5 inches or 9 centimeters. I'm just going to make these buttons a perfect square. So I'll marquee over the top row of buttons and then copy paste with Control C, Control V, dragging down and holding Shift. Then I'll tap my right click and again enter in 3.5 inches or 9 centimeters. So before I simulate this, I'm just going to select all of the patterns of my wearer's right body and pull them forward a bit. I move the collar up so it doesn't collide with the lapel, and I'll strengthen all those patterns with Control H or Command L. And I had those internal button markings sewn together previously, so I need to delete that with my Edit Sewing tool before I simulate. I also selected all my buttons and assigned them to my gold anchor shank button. If you like this button, I've made it a free download on my website for you, and the link is in the description below. The last thing to do with the button wrap are the top two non-functional buttons. With your Select Move Button tool, you can just copy paste this button, holding Shift and going straight up, tap your right click and enter in that same measurement of the button spacing, 3.5 inches or 9 centimeters. In a women's jacket, it's already going to look a bit spaced out because of the way the jacket splays open at the bust, but I still suggest moving them out a bit. You can just click and drag it out and tap your right click. I'm going to put mine a ½ inch out. You mostly want to make sure this button stance is narrower than your lapel width. When you're happy with the placement, you can just right click on it and duplicate it to the symmetric pattern. These buttons can be tricky with women's wear because you don't want them to highlight the apex. I might move mine in 1/4 inch, but it's up to you and your design. Now we're going to change our collar and lapel shape from this notched version to a peak lapel. You can see the peak lapel I did is a bit lower than the notch, so we'll need to lengthen our collar as well as figure out the lapel shape. This tutorial is more about altering an existing jacket by sight and design aesthetic from the visual reference in 3D. But if you want standard measurements for drafting a peak lapel from scratch, I'll put a link in the description to a tutorial by the Modeliste. With my block, I personally would get it the way I like in 3D and then check it in a sample. The first thing I'm going to do is with Edit Pattern, I'm going to hold Shift and select all the edges of my lapel. Then I'll right-click on one of them and choose Duplicate as Mirrored Internal Line. It's going to reflect the shape over a line, so I'm going to select my roll line as the line that I want it reflected over. If I compare my current jacket to the peak lapel I already created, the point of the peak lapel is maybe a little bit below the original lapel point. And I've estimated I want my lapel width to be 2.5 inches. So I'm going to draw a line square to my lapel point, but I'm going to drag it down a tiny bit. Again, this is all visual. The first time I did this, I just referenced some images of peak lapels that I liked the proportions of. So I'll move my lapel point down to meet that line. Then this point I'll just move until I'm happy with the way that it looks. I'm going to drag this point down the roll line to get an idea of the angle of that seam with the collar. I know my final one ended up being about 1.9 inches for the point and just over an inch for the seam. If you wanted to widen the curve of this here, you could grab your Edit Curve Point tool and reshape that until you're happy with it. I'll just do mine a little to show you. Then with Edit Pattern, I'm going to select those lines, right-click and choose Duplicate as Mirrored Internal Line again, and reflect it over my roll line. So this will be my reference for how to edit the lapel curve here. Then I'm going to grab my collar and rotate it a bit to match it up with the neck. I'm going to hold Shift and select these two lines of my collar, then the 2 lines of the neck opening, and right-click and select Match Up to Center. You can see if I set my fabric view to translucent and my collar is matched up at the notch, it should overlap HPS here on your pattern by roughly 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. This notch here on my collar should line up with HPS. The back here should match your back neck. That means these 2 lines here should match each other because they will sew together. So now I'll start matching up my lapel with the markings I have using Edit Pattern and Edit Curve Point on the lapel's curve. I'll marquee over these points here to move the collar and neckline at the same time. I'll also marquee over the roll line of the collar, lapel, and the point on the collar. The other point should be an extension of this line. Mine is measuring about 2.5 inches, so with internal polygon, I just drew a line here that was 2.5 inches from the notch point. However, when I moved these points to match the line, I didn't love how sharp this angle was here on the collar. So I decided to undo how I moved the collar points, and what I'm going to do with Transform Pattern is select the collar, double click, and move this center pivot point here. I'm going to rotate it ever so slightly, making sure that I don't reduce the overlap here by more than 0.3 inches. Then I need to move these points of the collar to match the jacket again, because I'm going to move them all together. And now I'll try this again, matching up these 2 points, drawing a line here that extends to 2.5 inches, then dragging these points down to meet it. And now I feel like the transition here is much smoother and not too sharp. Now for the collar notch point. I'm going to hold the D key and Control while I drag this so that I don't change anything about the top collar edge just yet. Then holding Control, I'm going to slide this down. I'm just going to eyeball it, but to me it looks about 1/4 of an inch shorter here than the lapel point. I often find this slit here can be nearly closed, if not actually matching in the pattern, and once it's on the body, it naturally splits open. So let's select the body fronts and collar, strengthen them, and simulate. You can unstrengthen with Ctrl H or Command L. You can smooth out the transition of the collar roll line to the lapel roll line if you want. I do recommend having fold rendering checked on if you want these to look nice and crisp. If you wanted to change the angle of this seam here, then you would need to drop this point down and make the angle of this line flatter. This angle is that seam there, if you can imagine the collar and lapel rolled over this line. So you drop these 2 points down and move these points so this is all one continuous straight line. And that will soften the angle of this seam. You need to be sure you're moving your collar and jacket together. If your patterns aren't still matched up in 2D like mine, just make sure that these 2 segments match because they will sew together. I recommend keeping these 2 patterns matched up like this until you're sure you're happy with the shape of everything. So now you can delete all the lapel markings and extra internal lines and rotate your collar back along the grain line. I wouldn't worry about making this line super smooth if yours looks a little jagged like mine. Now we're going to change this from a single vent at center back to 2 side vents along that side back seam. I'm going to do this a super simple way by basically just copying the vent shape and markings that I already have. To start, I'm going to copy and paste the other side of my back pattern. I'm going to right click and send it to the back so I can lay it under the pattern I'm going to be editing. Then I'm going to copy my fabric up here, select this pattern and assign it to the copied fabric with this down arrow. Then I'll change the color of the copied fabric. I do this a lot when I want to trace things out and reference patterns underneath mine. I'm going to line my patterns up at this bottom right point. Then I'm going to select the pattern underneath, double click the center point, and move the point of rotation down to the bottom corner so that I can line them up along this edge. My vent measures 8.76 inches, or a little over 22 centimeters at the tallest edge. So with Edit Pattern, I'm going to split my pattern at 8.76. on both my back body and my side back. Then with Edit Sewing, I'm going to drag my sewing up to those points so that the side back seam hangs free from the vent down. With Add Point Split Line, I'm just going to click down and add 2 points anywhere on these lines. It doesn't matter where, because then with Edit Pattern, I'm going to click and drag them to match my vent shape. With Internal Polygon, I'm just going to draw in the connecting fold line. Now in order to do the side back pattern, I'm going to right click on this pattern and choose Flip Horizontally. Another way to align these is to right-click and choose Rotate Parallel to, and then select this segment of the side back pattern as your reference line, and then the fold line of the vent on the back pattern. Now these lines will be parallel, so I can just slide it behind and snap it to the side back. Then I just move those points I added to copy the vent shape and draw in the fold line like we did before. With Edit Pattern, I can right-click and cut the original vent extension off and delete those patterns. With Edit Sewing, we'll now extend the sewing at center back so that the seam is sewn closed. Then we can select these two segments of our adjoining patterns, right-click and say Match Up to End. The side back vent will extend under the center back pattern, so with Edit Pattern, if you want to hold Control and drag up this point, you can be sure that it won't stick out the bottom of the jacket. It is very slight though. Then you can reset the side back along its grain line by right-clicking and selecting under Rotate, and now I'll delete the reference pattern. The center back pattern's vent is going to fold back on itself. So what I'm going to do is select all the vent segments with Edit Pattern by holding Shift, right-click and choose Duplicate as Mirrored Internal Line, and select the fold line as the line to mirror them over. Then I'll adjust the bottom angle to match the jacket body. Then I'll do the same. I'll select those internal lines and right-click Duplicate as Mirrored Internal Line again. Then I can move this point to match the internal marking. I want to keep this internal marking for the vent to sew to when it's folded back, but I don't need this internal marking on top of the vent extension, and I don't need the segment at the bottom here, so I'll just delete this endpoint. Now we need to fold the vents back on the center back pattern. In 3D with fold arrangement, I'm going to fold back by dragging this red arrow around the circle. Then I'll just set the angle in the property editor down to 25 and check fold rendering on. Now with free sewing, we just need to sew the vent edge to the internal marking. You'll need to sew the bottom edge separately and make sure you turn the sewing. With the Select Mesh Box tool, I'm just going to marquee over the center back vents, left click on the green in 3D and pull it towards me with the blue line of my gizmo. If you have a little shadow like this at the corner of your vent, it's just because your particle distance is high and it will go away when you lower it. Now I'm just going to sew the top of my vents together. Make sure your sewing in 2D is mirrored and be sure to turn the sewing. Lastly, you'll see if you select the patterns and put the particle distance and collision thickness down, they'll lie nice and flat. You can also select the vent sewing with your Edit Sewing tool and put the seam line intensity to 0. This will make it look as though there's no stitching through the jacket, which is what you would want. This would likely be sewn clean and not through the jacket itself, whether it's with a lining or a blind stitch or something like that.